Good evening and welcome to the Wheels of Justice. I'm Daniel Nadunya presiding over this session alongside Nanda Shipahu for sign language interpretation. Thank you so much for joining in. This week, Namibia commemorates Heroes' Day, a day on which we remember those who made sacrifices in the struggle for our freedom and reflect on the meaning of courage, dignity, and national identity. But this year, the commemoration takes on another profound dimension. Namibia has recently received human remains repatriated from South Africa following processes of exhumation and identification. The repatriation involves ancestral human remains whose return raises profound questions about colonialism, cultural dignity, identity, and the rights of communities to reclaim their ancestors. It also involves the remains of Namibian freedom fighters whose return and reburial carries a particular significance as the nation commemorates Heroes' Day and remembers those who made sacrifices for Namibia's liberation. The return of human remains is deeply emotional, but it is also deeply legal. Who has the authority to exhume a person who has already been buried? What rights do families and communities have? What does international law say when human remains are located in another country? And perhaps most importantly, when ancestors come home, is repatriation the end of the process, or is it only the beginning of restoration and justice? So, tonight we examine these questions from both a human rights and legal perspective, and from the perspective of the state's heritage and cultural administration. We'll be back shortly. Welcome back, Namibia, and this session is now in session. So joining me tonight is Dr. John Nakuta, a respected academic specializing in human rights and social justice, and no stranger to the wheels of justice. Dr. Nakuta, welcome. Good to see you again on this platform.
Thank you very much for the invitation. And
thank you.
Good evening. And
again, joining us and making his debut appearance is Dr. Goodman Kwasira, an archaeologist and heritage lecturer at the University of Namibia, making his first appearance. Thank you so much, Doc, for making time for the Wheels of Justice.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and good evening as well.
It is customary on this program that we afford an opportunity to those making their first appearance to present their maiden statement. If there is anything that I may have left out from introducing you, you may as well say that and tell our viewers, or perhaps if there is anything that you just want to bring to the fore.
Oh, thank you very much. I think you did justice as far as introducing me is concerned.
Did I get your name correct as well?
My name correctly.
Right.
Perhaps just one thing I might want to mention is that I'm not really representing the state per se, although I worked with the state institutions.
Right.
I will talk more from a practice point of view as someone who was working in this project in the state.
Yes. Perhaps by way of setting the scene, let's start again perhaps with you. I know that you participated in the whole process of exhuming and repatriation of those human remains back to Namibia. Perhaps let's explain these two terms, or maybe three terms: exhumation and repatriation, and perhaps restitution, if that is also relevant to the two.
Yes. Yeah, no, thank you so much. I think it's important to make that distinction. Exhumation basically is a systematic digging up of a body or remains of any human that had been buried before. And normally this is done for various purposes. It could be for forensic investigations where there is a crime that has been suspected, then one can be exhumed. But in our case here, the exhumations were done for, okay, among other reasons, to try and bring healing and closure, first of all, to the families that had lost their beloved ones, and also to the communities where they came from, and to the nation as a whole. Now, when it concerns the repatriation, it's really the process of bringing back or giving back. I like the fact that there is a colleague of ours who likes to use the German term Rückgabe, which is just giving back, and it ends there. But then restitution is now the process that comes after repatriation, and this entails a lot of other issues, such as, for example, restoration of justice, restoration of peace within the community itself, and making use and making the human remains and, in some cases, cultural objects useful within the community. This is whereby we try to see what were the skills that were used, for example, to make some cultural objects. Can we replicate those skills? Can we teach those skills to the younger generations? And also, the issue of memory and remembrance is at the heart of restitution. We need to work together with the communities to keep the memories of these people who passed on, and also how do we remember them within the community itself. Those are some of the issues that are involved in restitution, although there are many, many other issues that we can take into account when it comes to restitution.
Right. Dr. Nakuta, I tried to carry out some research in preparation for this engagement. However, I really found it very difficult to find any relevant domestic law that explicitly speaks to exhumation and repatriation. But that's why we have you here to help us understand what is the legal basis for exhumation and repatriation of human remains, especially from another jurisdiction. Do we have a domestic law that really regulates that?
Actually, you are right. In terms of Namibia, there's no framework law, so to speak, that governs the kind of issues that we are discussing tonight. Most probably the most closest that we can come, and Doc mentioned that already, not so much the act, but we have an old ordinance called the Burial Place Ordinance 27 of 1966 that give permission, for example, for the exhumation of a dead body, but under two very strict conditions. One, if it is done for lawful forensic exercise and purposes, as Doc mentioned, but also for public health orders. I can think here, for example, and Doc maybe correct me, if, for example, during a disease outbreak or whatever the case may be, bodies must be buried, but also there's suspicion that some of these dead bodies may have been, then there's that public health order that would allow, under this old Burial Place Ordinance of 1966, that can be invoked to exhume that dead body. In addition to that, and of course, let me just say, of course, now you may ask, but why rely on an old law of 1966? We've got a provision in the Constitution that says, and I think I'm speaking under correction, under Article 140, that says that in order to avoid a legal vacuum, when Namibia became independent, the provision says that the laws that were in force at the time of independence shall continue to exist until such time it has either been repealed or it has been annulled by
a statute or legislation.
By legislation or found invalid or declared rather invalid by a court of law. But of course, this piece of legislation has not been repealed. It has not been
found
declared
unconstitutional.
Unconstitutional. So it continues, and that is why one can look. But in addition to that, there may also be other pieces of legislation. For example, I checked also in terms of preparing for myself, the Local Authorities Act may also be relevant, even though it doesn't specifically talks about exhumation and repatriation, but it may be relevant because it deals with cemeteries.
Right.
And then, of course, also local authorities are having their own bylaws that governs very specifically where someone can be buried and also where someone may not be buried. So there's this whole mix of laws that,
yes.
And another one that may be also of relevance is the National Heritage Act of 2004, where a site is of relevance for heritage purposes. So there's no specific law in the case of Namibia that governs these things specifically, but you must read them all together. But of course, we must also then add to the mix. All this must be read in the context from the supremacy of the Namibian constitution, because everything, whether you exhume, whether you repatriate, whatever term we want to use, everything must be done in tandem
yes.
with the Namibian constitution.
I think what makes this case rather unique is the fact that this exhumation is rather one that took place from a foreign jurisdiction, and therefore finding the relevance of what Namibian law says about exhuming human remain from a different jurisdiction. I think that makes it a little bit unique and different. But Dr. Gwasira, perhaps help us understand the current undertaking that already took place. Perhaps what law was really relied on in especially exhuming those? Is it what Dr. Nakuta has alluded, or what did we rely on? Is it a domestic law or is it a foreign law?
Yes, thank you. I think I would like to start by just picking up from what Dr. Nakuta mentioned.
Yes.
See, when he was outlining all these laws, what really came into my mind is the fact that just like with any other issues regarding what we would regard as heritage, we need to apply the multiplicity of laws. You know, one needs to deal with the situation as it is and try to find out what kind of law can I apply here, especially in the case where we have our National Heritage Act, which may not be very explicit on issues of exhumation and how to handle human remains. So, and in this case, there's one thing that I think is very important, is the fact that we are dealing with people who have got a particular identity. They come from a particular community, which means that they are subjects of a particular traditional authority. Right. So even a law such as the Traditional Authorities Act of Namibia needs to be considered.
Yes.
Now, coming back to the specific case that we've got of the exhumations in South Africa, yes, we had to rely on South African laws because we were practicing in South Africa. And in this case, the law that we used mainly was the South African Heritage Resources Agency Act, which is Act 25 of 1999. It clearly specifies how one can work on graves and which graves can be treated as heritage. For example, the graves of all political prisoners are, by this law, heritage. And because they are heritage, we needed to get a permit from the South African Heritage Resources Agency, the SARA. But then at the same time, these two heroes who died at Robben Island were not buried at Robben Island. They were buried in secular cemeteries, one in Guguletu and one at Maitland. And these cemeteries, they fall under the City Council, the City of Cape Town. Yeah. So the bylaws of City of Cape Town had to apply. So we needed to get, again, a permit from the City of Cape Town to be able to do that. But in another layer that comes in within South Africa is that there should be a permit from the Inspector of Anatomy. Right. Because as we were working, they also had to make sure that there were health environmentalists who were there to make sure that we are complying with the laws. For example, when the human remains are exposed, we needed to use lime, for example, to make sure that they don't continue being infectious if they were infectious, because we don't know. These prisoners were buried 55 years ago, so we don't know even how they were prepared before they were buried. So we need to take all that into account. Then, of course, the South African Heritage Act was taken into play. This is just now for the exhumation. So in other words, what we are looking at here, we can say we are looking at three legal moments, so to speak. There's the pre-exhumation, which in this case, we can talk about the ancestors in the museum, which demanded that those ancestors needed to be deaccessioned. In other words, they had to be removed from the list of being South African heritage property forever.
Right.
And that is under the South African Heritage Resources Act. Then after that, the laws I've just mentioned now, they apply to the exhumation. Then there's the export of it. We still needed to get some health clearance certificate, even customs certificates as well, so that we could get them. And on the Namibian side, we also had to have we had to satisfy some requirements for NAMRA, for example, so that we can actually bring them into the country. Namibia requires that these were because they are treated as, they are not just cultural objects, they are humans. So
Right.
they needed death certificates so that they can have a burial order.
Wow.
These death certificates were then to be obtained from South Africa.
That was the challenge, yes, because initially there were no death certificates. Remember, they died as convicts,
Yes.
so there were no death certificates. But eventually, the Robben Island Museum helped us to obtain some death certificates for them, so that at least we could come with them to Namibia. Otherwise, it was going to be difficult for them to land at Hosea Kutako International Airport without those death certificates.
Right.
But perhaps I could just mention one thing about the death certificates.
Yes.
This was a process of rehumanization. Because remember, when they went there, when they were in prison, they didn't have names. Yeah. They had numbers. They were, they were seen as convicts, yes, but even in burial, they were not buried. Of course, they were buried as humans, but without that concept of being seen as humans. So giving them the identity which was stripped away from them was a form of rehumanization that was happening there.
Mm. Quite some
I've just,
revelation there.
Yes, exactly. Wow, very interesting. If you don't mind, I just want to jump in. Whilst Doc was talking in the beginning, he was explaining the difference between exhumation, repatriation, and restoration. Mm. And again, for me, from a human rights perspective, two terms is worth stressing. The question of restitution and the question of restoration. Restitution for us from a human rights perspective is part of the whole package of reparations. Reparations includes restitution, and for us from a legal point of view, human rights point of view, is then we see restitution as a remedy to restore what has been broken, what has been taken, like in this case, taken unlawfully. For us, that would be restitution. But then restitution, restoration is what you are now saying. For us, from a human rights perspective, would presupposes redoing the indignity, rebuilding the indignity that these people have suffered. They didn't have names. Now the family is saying that we want to give you back your dignity that you were stripped of, and whatever the case may be. So it's really very, very important that we see that this thing, what has happened, is not just for mere symbolism. It is to restore the dignity from which the people were stripped of. Yeah.
And restoration and restitution can then extend as far as the family and the communities affected.
Yes,
isn't
definitely, definitely so.
Perhaps what also came out when Dr. Gwasira was explaining, especially the send-off from South Africa and all the processes that took place. It is now clear that, yes, we relied on South African laws for all that. But there is a question that remains upon receiving. What legal framework did we rely on? Because now you see the human remains are now in Namibia and we are receiving. Of course, you spoke about compliance with some kind of NAMRA procedures and stuff like that. But apart from that, what else did we rely on? Is it what Dr. Nakuta earlier on spoke about, the Local Authority Act, the ordinance, burial ordinance, or what did we rely on to receive? Of course, to send, we relied on the South African law, but to receive?
Yeah, I would say, first of all, what in an ideal situation, we should be having a policy on human remains and the restitution of human remains. Now, where are we as far as that policy is concerned? It's in a draft form, and it's been going through some consultations. So they've already some consultations that happened with traditional authorities. Now it's waiting to be taken to the Attorney General, upon which, when it comes from the Attorney General, it's going to be taken again to the communities for validation before it can be taken to Cabinet. So, but that policy on its own has got some steps that we should follow in terms to receiving. That is for future purposes.
Yes.
Unfortunately, what we are faced with at the moment is a situation where what we practiced right now, and also even some returns that happened of human remains before and cultural possessions, they happened in a situation where the laws that exist did not really consider them, right? But again, let's take, for example, the National Heritage Act of 2004. That one is basically being reviewed, and these issues are going to come in. So basically, in such circumstances, there are two things that one would rely on in the circumstances that we are. First of all, you would look at international best practices. You find out what's happening, how are the countries doing that, and you try to apply that within your situation so that at least it can be comparable. And the most important thing why it should be comparable here is because, as I would always emphasize, these are human beings, so there is an issue of dignity. We need to treat them with dignity. Even if people might think they are skeletal remains, they are human remains, they are mortal remains. Right? They have a soul, they have a family. I mean, it was so painful to see the daughter of one of the people that we exhumed in South Africa. I mean, it was really painful to see her engaging with the remains of her father, whom she did not see in her life. So you can really tell that we need to treat them with dignity. But at the same time, above these international best practices, we also look at some international conventions that can be applicable in our particular case. Those are the ones that one can actually use in this case. Maybe, Doctor?
Doctor, I just wanted us to, the word that was used by Dr. Gwasira is humanize these remains. I want us to give it some human perspective. I mean, strip away the politics, strip away the ceremony. We know that this undertaking took place as part of Namibia's Heroes' Day commemoration. What should Namibians see when they look at this undertaking? With what eye and perspective should Namibians really look at the undertaking?
Right. I think we've already alluded to it. We're trying to say that it is not just mere symbolism. Through this Heroes Day commemorations, it's tried to humanize and to restore the dignity from which our people were stripped from. So that is really very important. But also, very importantly, when it comes to, and I want to go back to what Doctor mentioned, in terms of, and you've mentioned it also, in terms of there not being sufficient legal instruments governing the process.
Yes.
Namibia has this very wonderful, and we spoke about it, or I don't know whether, we haven't yet for tonight, this wonderful provision in the Constitution, Article 144. For human rights scholars, Article 144, I'm saying, makes the circle bigger. What do we mean by this? Because Article 144 says, where Namibia has signed and ratified international instruments that are binding upon the state, those instruments form part and parcel of our legal system.
Right.
So these are laws that one can then use. Oh, excuse me. What did I now do? Sorry. And so there is this very specific international legal instrument that I want to quote from very directly, and that is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. It addresses the issue of repatriation in no uncertain terms in Article 12 thereof. And let me just quote it verbatim with your permission.
Yes, please.
It says, states shall seek to enable the access and repatriation of ceremonial objects and human remains in their possessions through fair, that is how we try to humanize it, fair, transparent, and effective mechanisms developed in conjunction, very importantly, with indigenous people concerned. And this is how this whole process, I think I've watched it on the news. NBC had a very nice insert during the news and showed how the rituals were conducted, and I was so impressed on how there at the graveside the families engaged and tried to give dignity back to these people. And there was this meme that was actually saying, and I'm paraphrasing her, you were taken from your motherland, your forefathers didn't even know that you came here and whatever, and we didn't know where you were, where you went to, but now we came, and we came to collect you and to take you back to where you rightfully belonged. Very profound. And this is part of giving dignity back to the people, giving humanity back to the people that were stripped from their humanity.
Perhaps, gentlemen, in practical terms then, how does the state or government translate those international obligations into actual repatriation process? I know you, Dr. Gwazira, you may have witnessed that, but Dr. Nakuta, of course, as well.
Again, under international law,
yes,
there is this free, prior, and informed consent. No exhumation must happen without genuine consultation with the affected communities. And I suppose we've seen the communities, a delegation of the traditional communities. It tells me that appears there were some consultations that was engaged with. And so this is how you operationalize what you now said. Some of these international instruments, how do you give it flesh? And as I said, very importantly, through engaging them via obtaining their free, prior, and informed consent with what is to happen with their human remains of their beloved ones.
Can the rights of living people be violated by what happens to the remains of people who have been dead for decades?
Yes, because you remember, we say human rights are indivisible.
Right.
Like in this particular case, what we mean when we say that human rights are indivisible, you cannot put human rights, the various rights that we have, in a compartment. You can't how do you say that word?
Compartmentalize.
Yes. Like, for example, the right to human dignity that
Yes.
these people are having or were having, it's very closely connected to their right to a family, to their right to a culture. So by continuing with the dehumanization, for argument's sake, of this dead person, you may then perpetuate the violation of the right to a family, the right to cultural heritage, the right to religion, and
Yes.
whatever. So yes, these rights are intertwined. They can't be divorced. So to answer that question, that is how I would answer it the way you are.
Thank you so much. You are still watching The Wheels of Justice here on NBC. After a short break, we will continue answering more questions on the subject matter. So don't go away. We'll be back in a jiffy.
Dear Namibia, for 30 years, it's been our honor to power your homes, your dreams, your lives, and to empower the sustainable economic development of our country. Every spark of progress, every milestone we've reached has been because of you. And just like electricity, our bond only gets stronger when we're connected. We look forward to many more powerful years, brighter, bolder, together. With love, Nampower. Celebrating 30 years. Nampower, powering the nation and beyond.
Welcome back, Namibia. And this is The Wheels of Justice with me, Daniel Nadunya. Today we discuss the law in respect of exhumation, repatriation and restoration. Dr. John Nakuta and Dr. Gwasira are my Leonard guests in the studio. So this conversation continues. As we continue from where we actually ended, we know that these are two sets of human remains that we are talking about here. It's the ancestors who were then taken back some years ago, but we are also talking about the remains of freedom fighters who then were prisoners of the Robben Island. Perhaps, Dr. Gwasira, if you can help us distinguish the processes that the two sets of remains went through, perhaps so that we just understand, was it the same process or was this two different processes? Of course, you spoke about one where humanization took place. Was it the same with the remains that were taken in some centuries ago, or was it two different processes?
Yes. Now, if you may allow me, perhaps it is a question of terminology as well,
Yes,
because
please.
we started with some terminologies.
Yes.
I think the one thing that we might want to start thinking about is this term human remains.
Right.
The term human remains from a museological practice perspective is an administrative term, which was part and parcel of dehumanization, because it actually classified the people according to their particular communities, so the ones that were seen at that time. But at the same time as well, this term, we are trying to move away from the term. That is why in the case of the two sets that came back to Namibia, we made a very clear distinction between ancestral remains, and I'll explain why we call them ancestral remains, and the mortal remains.
Right.
So the mortal remains here is, when you'll be reading about this, in the particular case, they are referring to the 2 political prisoners.
Those are mortal
remains. Yeah, mortal remains, yes. But the ancestral remains, we are referring to those that were in the museum, and they've got a particular and deeply problematic history, a history of their collection. Perhaps I can start by giving that context, that we are talking here of ancestral remains that were collected from all over Namibia, but they represent some specific communities, and in no particular order, I would say the Awambo, the Damara, the San, the Herero, and the Nama. Those are the 5 communities that are represented in this group that we brought from South Africa now.
Okay.
Now, all of these were collected at the behest of the then director of the South African Museum, Louis Peringwe, who believed that some specific communities were going to get extinct. So they wanted to preserve their features.
Okay.
Every day you don't practice speaking English is a day you...
They also wanted to study them, basically. They were used in pseudoscience, which was basically racial sciences. That is why we find them very, very problematic. So the process that we followed for these particular ancestral remains was that, first of all, we can go as far back as 2012, when the then Minister of Sport, Arts and Culture in South Africa, who coincidentally is now the Deputy President, Paul Mashatile, he wrote a letter to the museums and said, any human remains and cultural objects that are in museums that were collected unethically must be returned to their places of origin. That's where really everything started. And then there was a directive to these museums. Thankfully, the Isiko museums in the Western Cape had already started thinking about this. So they went through a process of identification of human remains from different, or ancestral remains from different communities by looking through their registers. And then they removed them from the storage into one storage where no one had access to it. They were deaccessioned. They were in the storage where no one had access, and waiting for the different countries to request for their return, which is basically what happened. Then Namibia requested for the return. And once Namibia requested for the return, that's when now this committee on the repatriation of ancestral remains was constituted. And our work started now of provenance research. Basically, we went and we looked at all these documents to, first of all, verify whether exactly these ancestral remains come from Namibia, and where do they come from within Namibia in terms of regions. Also, how were they collected? Because we now know that some of them were purchased. They were sold. Right? Some of them were donated. There are a few, but not so many, that were exhumed soon after death and sent there. So in addition to the registers, we also had to go through the archives of the museum. So what we were practicing here is some kind of forensic history, if one was, whereby we were reading all the correspondence letters and matching them with particular individuals. And this has got an implication on what's going to happen with the human remains, with ancestral remains. Why is it that we cannot immediately give them to the communities? It's because this process of provenance research is ongoing. So far, we have certified that they are from Namibia. They can come to Namibia, but we also have collected all the documentation, which we will continue studying, so that we will be very certain when they are given to a particular community that if we say these are were brought in and the letters show that they were Nama, then they can be given to the Nama community.
Yes, right? Because that's where I was actually heading to with my question, to say, okay, now look, we have them in Namibia, but who actually has the rights and custody over these, whether ancestral remains or whether mortal remains? Who has custody? Is it the state? Is it the family? Is it the descendant? Is it the traditional authority? Is it the local authority? Who has the rights and, over these remains?
In the case of the ancestral remains, it was a state-to-state repatriation. So they will remain in the custody of the state on the behalf of the community.
That is the ancestral remains?
The ancestral remains, okay. Yes. So they will remain in the custody of the state, and it was really clearly stated by the president upon receipt that they will be under the custody of the Ministry of Education, Innovation, Youth, Sports, Arts and Culture until such a time that they can be restored to their particular communities, okay, for reburial. But what's very important is that throughout the whole process, as Dr. Nakuta said, they rightly noted that the communities were involved. They were consulted right from the onset, and the consultations will continue as well. So at the end of the day, the communities are the ones who are going to decide what they are going to do with that. They are going to inform the state what they are going to do with that.
Yes.
All we can do is institutions of higher education and the state is that we will try and expand the research so that we are certain when the communities request, or rather, I don't want to use the word demand, but when the communities come and ask for them,
right,
you know, and they can be. So basically, these are under the custody of the state, but
yes,
on the behalf of the community.
Yes, but that's really in respect of the ancestral remains. Yes. What about the mortal remains?
Well, the mortal remains, again, first of all, let's take it back to before the exhumations.
Yes.
The families had to sign a consent form to allow us to exhume.
Yes. And
they also, in a way, not in a way, but they gave permission to the state to look after the mortal remains until they are reburied at the Heroes Acre. So basically, yes, we cannot say the state, they belong to the state. They belong to the families, but they are being taken care by the state on the behalf of the families and with the consent of the families.
Perhaps while with that, what happens, Dr. Nakuta, if family objects to a particular form of reburial? Maybe to start with, they object to perhaps exhumation and then reburial. What happens in that case? What takes precedence? Is it the will of the family or is it the state? We know that, of course, we belong to the state, but we also belong to our family members.
I don't know whether it's correct to say that we belong to the state.
What would be the correct position?
The state is ultimately responsible for its subjects.
Yes.
But we are not state property. So the state can't dictate, at least in my view, unlawful things and stuff. The state must act responsibly. And coming back to the notion of free, prior and informed consent. If there is a particular community that says that we don't want our mother, father or beloved one to be buried at Heroes Acre, I would say that the will of that particular family, the will of that particular community must prevail. Because the state, in order to do so, must acquire the free, prior and informed consent. And if the community or family did not give their consent to that kind of a reburial, exhumation, he said that the family had to, in the case of South Africa, had to sign a consent form whereby they gave the South African government, of course the Namibian government included then, the permission to exhume. That it's the same principle. So and I don't know whether we can mention names now here, but there is a particular family that is apparently objecting to their beloved one, their father, their grandfather, to be exhumed, to be reburied at Heroes Acre. Are they right in doing so? By all means, in terms of human rights standards and principles, yes, surely. But of course, no human right is absolute. So yes, in as much as you've got the right to be consulted, but if you unreasonably withhold your consent, I suppose that would be a different story altogether. But I don't want to go into that.
Yes, but how much of legal weight should such objection carry, if any, from a family, for it to be considered legitimate?
Very, very much, very high legal weight, because it is not just this is what the state wants to do. It ultimately comes back to the family. Because remember, we said the family has a right, as entrenched in the Constitution, the right to a family, right to cultural heritage, right to religion. And so if it is not in accordance with any of this, then I would say they can rightfully so, until the converse is proven.
Yes.
Yeah.
This recent repatriation comes against the backdrop of Heroes Day commemoration. And perhaps that brings us to a much bigger question. Of course, we've dealt with it during our conversation, but I think I want us to just return to that. Is returning and reburial enough? I'm bringing us back to the issue of restoration, restitution, and all those terms. Should repatriation be understood as the beginning, perhaps, of a broader process of restoration, restitution, and perhaps historical justice?
I think Doc mentioned it very nicely.
Yes.
Maybe he should repeat what he said, because that was really excellent, what you said.
No, I think you are right in saying that repatriation, which is return, is not the end. In fact, it is the beginning of the major work after that. And this is the work that includes a lot of activities. Even the rehumanization that we were talking about there, it has to continue. The consulting of the communities in making sure that the customary practices are adhered to. Yes, we had the customary rights that were done in South Africa, but again, when it comes, that's with considering the two political prisoners or the two heroes, that was quite clear. But basically, when it comes to the ancestral remains, there are still, of course, some customary rights that have got to be done by the communities themselves. And for me, what is also quite important is the fact that, and this is for both sets of ancestral remains, of course, ancestral and mortal remains, right? Is the fact that they should be useful for the nation. And useful, one of the uses, when I say it can be useful, is lest we forget. This is an opportunity for us to teach the young ones about the history of Namibia. This is an opportunity for us to realize that when we talk about Namibian colonialism, we should not talk about it in the singular form. Namibia is one of those very unique countries that experienced multiple colonialisms. And all those multiple colonialisms, they had their own mark that they left on Namibia. And some of these marks, we can find them now today as evidenced by ancestral remains and mortal remains that are coming. And beyond that, there's even a set that we did not even talk about right now. There are casts that were made of living people. Remember at the beginning, I said they wanted to preserve the features of people that they feared that they were getting extinct. So they would actually cast a person with plaster of Paris so that they could have these features and preserve them. And who were being cast? People from prisons. Some of them from a prison here in Windhoek, which is not far from the government office park, actually, which was the old Windhoek prison there. You know, and people were taken into these prisons without their consent. They were cast, and these casts, they ended up in the South African Museum. Perhaps, I don't know if I should mention this, but it was not only the full bodies. There are some that we know are very sensitive. Some parts of bodies that are sensitive, that were cast. And again, this issue of how do we deal with this from a customary point of view, from our traditions? So I am a researcher. I'm working with these ones in the museum. Then I'm told that there are some parts of females that are in those boxes. Can I, as a male person, go and study, not study them, but even look at them and add them to the list? No, I can't. This is now where we come and say, okay, what does our tradition say?
Yes.
Not only our tradition, but the tradition of the people who were cast. If we are not allowed to do that, then someone who is female must do that kind of work.
Of course.
But it goes beyond those things, really.
Yes.
And so after that, in fact, the term that we use in restitutionary studies is that the ancestral remains, cultural possessions, and many other things that were collected, they have afterlives. It doesn't end there. They continue to live within our communities. Perhaps if you allow me, I can give an example that is not coming from here, but I think it's one of the best examples that is hailed all over the world, which happened here in Namibia. When some cultural possessions were returned from the Berlin Ethnological Museum, the Museums Association of Namibia, UNAM, and National Museum of Namibia came together and said, how can we make these useful within our communities? UNAM, our main job is to teach students and research. So we had some students who went there and they took some of these materials and went with them into the communities and started asking these communities, who made this? What was it made for? How was it used? What do you think we should do with this particular material? Artists, designers, they came in, they were inspired by what was made more than 50 years ago. And they started now reproducing their own materials using modern materials, but being inspired by this. And I think this is now part of restitution, which is not like physical restitution, but restitution in terms of knowledge and information.
Even memorialization.
Yes.
Right. Gentlemen, this quite a complex matter, and I don't think an hour is enough for a conversation like this, but we should accept we don't own time. Time has its own identity and its own nature. When it's time, it's time. But maybe in closing, Dr. Nakuta, if you could identify just one legal principle that should guide every future repatriation, exhumation and repatriation of human remains, be it ancestral or mortal remains, what would it be?
I'm actually conflicted between two, the free, prior and informed consent that I've stressed, but having listened to Doctor, the issue of memorialization, that is also part of the package of reparations, is something that we need really to invest in and to prioritize.
Yes.
That's what I'm saying.
And Dr. Kwasira, from a researcher's perspective, what is the most important thing that Namibia must just get right going forward?
Well, I'm not sure. There are many things, but perhaps to start with, we have got a very good policies as far as research is concerned, but we need to invest more in researchers. We need to invest more, especially young researchers in our institutions of higher learning. Coincidentally, before I left, I was telling my students that this is a lifetime work. You know, you can actually do this for the rest of your life. So we really think that we need to bring issues of, by the way, we've already started bringing them in our heritage courses at UNAM about restitution. It's now basically a module that is standing on its own, but I feel that it should be a whole course on restitution and repatriation in preparing these young researchers so that we've got what I would call a critical mass of researchers, whether they are teachers working somewhere, but they should be able to do this kind of research.
Wow. Dr. Nakuta, briefly, 20 seconds, final submission from you.
I want to congratulate the government for what we've seen live on television, for giving that rehumanizing, that nice word that you've used.
Yes.
The family that has been dehumanized. I watched it on television and I was very impressed. So congratulations to the government and the leadership under the president.
Tangi, Dr. Gwasira.
I would want to say the same sentiments. Basically, this was a very, very huge job. This is the first time that we know worldwide where we've got more than about 86 remains being retained at the same time. And I think the government did a great job in doing this, especially leading it. As you can see, this involved many different ministries and institutions, and just bringing all these together. And I think the Ministry of Education, Ministry of Education, Innovation, Youth, Sports and Culture, they did a very sterling job in this case. Yeah.
Mwaitabasa.
Tinotenda.
Tonight, we have looked beyond the emotion of bringing Namibian human remains home. Perhaps the most important lesson is that bringing human remains home is not simply about where they are buried. It is also about who they are and who they were. Who remembers them? Who has the right to speak for them? And whether the injustices surrounding their removal have truly been addressed. As Namibia commemorates Heroes Day, we remember not only those who gave their lives for the country, but also the continuing responsibility to preserve dignity, history, and justice for generations to come. Because justice does not always end with judgment. Sometimes justice begins with bringing someone home. Thank you for watching The Wheels of Justice, but this session is now adjourned. Thank you. Thank you so much.
This is NBC One. It's ours.
Out!